So welcome to our latest Birch Bark Editing in Conversation event with Erin Flanagan and Joshua Dolezal. Thank you for being here and for sharing our love of books and the craft that goes into making them. I have just a few announcements, and then I'll turn things over to Josh, who's going to introduce Erin to you, and she will introduce Josh back to you. You can find information for everything that I'm talking about at our birchbarkediting.com website, but Kat's also going to post the links in the chat and you can find them there as well. So we're hosting our next Mix and Meet generative writing workshop on September 6th at 5 p.m. Eastern, 2 p.m. Pacific. You can join us and jumpstart your writing. Our online journal, Microlit Almanac, is opening for submissions on September 1st. We take flash prose and poetry that's under 1,000 words. And I'm teaching a Moments in Miniature class on flash prose writing Sunday, September 25th. And Kat is teaching a Micros and More flash class on Sunday, October 23rd. And the next In Conversation event is Tuesday, September 13th with the poets Judith Baumel and Rachel Haddis. And then finally, you're willing to help support these free author events by hitting the donate button at the bottom of our homepage. Thank you as always for your generous support. And I'm ready to turn things over to you, Josh.
Great. Well, thanks so much for having us, Max. And I'm thrilled to reconnect with my grad school buddy, Erin Flanagan. We both went to the University of Nebraska, and we were just talking football because football season's right around the corner. So go Big Red. I feel like I have to get that out there before we start. But I think we only took one class together. We had a fiction writing class with the inestimable Judith Slater. And it's so amazing that we can reconnect all these years later, around the love of writing, because that was a side project for me at the time. I was working on a literature dissertation, and Erin and I have kept in touch throughout the years, and I've watched her do amazing things. She's a full professor at Wright State University and has been winning awards at kind of an alarming rate recently with novels. So I'm not going to read the full bio. I'll trust that if you got the event invitation, you've perused that or can if you would like. But I do want to highlight her latest two works. So her first novel, her debut novel, Deer Season, was published in 2021. It was the winner of the 2022 Edgar Award for the best first novel by an American author. It was a finalist for the 2022 Midwest Book Award in Fiction in the literary, contemporary, and historical category. And it's still under consideration as a finalist for the Macavity Award for the best first mystery, sponsored by the Mystery Readers International. So that debut novel has been a raging success. And somehow she was able to turn around another novel 1 year later, despite all of these pandemic obstacles that we've been navigating. And so her latest work is Blackout, published just this year, and it has already been chosen as a June 2022 Amazon First Reads pick. And I'm sure more awards will be rolling in as the year progresses. So if you'd like to check out Erin's books, you can go to her website, erinflanagan.net, which is ERINFLANAGAN.net. And I'll turn things over to Erin.
All right. Thank you, Josh. Thanks for that intro. So we actually did have another class together. It was in our master's program. Maybe you were already in your PhD, but it was the long novel, long British novel, Victorian, I think. We read Dickens, George Eliot, and I can't remember the other one. And we read 6 novels and they were long. And I did not do, it was the only class in my master's that didn't get an A, but I also was lucky to get what I got because I didn't do very well. I was, I think, my first semester, and I still was like, I can't even talk in class. I was so nervous, but you know, I remember you were in there. Yeah.
The other author was Anthony Trollope, and I think
yes.
I've been ruined on his work ever since. So
yes, and you know what? I married a Dickens and a Trollope scholar. It's the same person. I'm not married to 2 men. But yeah, isn't that crazy? So obviously the class had a lasting effect on me. Well, thank you for that intro. So I thought I would read a little bit from the opening of Blackout. which is, as Josh said, my most recent novel. It came out in July with Thomas and Mercer. And this one is somewhat of a thriller. So I'm going to read for about 8 to 10 minutes. And I'm starting in the first chapter, but I've skipped a couple pages. So I think the only thing you need to know, well, first of all, let me introduce Belle. This is my cat. And she may be walking back and forth, but I have learned over the last 2 years, this is the least invasive thing she does. If I lock her out of the room, like she will howl the whole time. So you may be seeing lots of her throughout the night. But I think the only thing you need to know is that Maris, my main character, she's 7 months sober. She's a sociology professor. She's married to Noel. And there's going to be a moment when she has a blackout in the story. And so I will make a dramatic pause because you can't see it in the text that it skips a couple lines. So the dramatic pause is not me just trying to be dramatic, but that's the blackout. I didn't want anybody to get uncomfortable. Like, is she gonna speak again? Like, it's a little weird. Okay. So as Maris sorted the junk mail into the recycling, she asked Cody about her day, who she sat with at lunch, how Miss Martin liked her little library idea for honors ELA, and Cody chatted along, volleying back questions about Maris's most recent article on Vox and her fall classes. Since February, Maris had done damage control and a relationship with her daughter, not wanting to bother Code with her problems. So she smiled brightly and didn't mention the devastating meeting with her department chair, the less than stellar results of her tenure vote. She remembered how her own parents would fight in front of her when she was a child, the problem's public fodder. She didn't want to be that person to her daughter. Her phone dinged with a text from Noel as she was plucking the silverware from the clean dishwasher for dinner. Swinging by Yanni's, the text said, then home, XO. Maris felt a spike of irritation. He'd picked up an extra shift at the hospital, an ever-weary eye toward their student loan balances, but she'd hoped he'd be home for dinner. She wanted to tell him about her department's tenure vote, get the bad news off her back, but this was what she got for marrying a saint. He worked in the ER with Yanni, a nurse whose husband was in Afghanistan. She and Kareem were expecting their first baby in a few months, and Noel had been helping with the nursery while Kareem was deployed, painting the walls, assembling the crib. He'd even helped her put together a custom closet from the Container Store, specially sized to baby hangers. He'd shaken his head in wonder as he held his hands 6 inches apart to demonstrate to Maris how tiny a baby's shoulders would be. At the time, she'd mimicked with the width of her own hands and held it down to her crotch, saying, try telling that to Yanni. Tonight, she figured his delay would at least give her another hour or so to work, and she texted back the red heart emoji and the face blowing a kiss emoji, then continued the neat rows of alternating squash, zucchini, eggplant, red peppers, and potatoes as she and Cody stacked the veggies for ratatouille. First on her list was the starter rebuttal letters for a tenure vote, but Maris pushed it from her mind before she could get angry or tear up, wanting instead to concentrate on Cody, the upcoming career day. Right now, her advice would be, don't become an academic. When the timer dinged, Cody reached for the plates in the cupboard and Maris told her just 2. No, Noel, Cody asked. Helping Yanni, she said, and Cody set 2 fiesta plates, turquoise and lemongrass, on the table as her mom brought in the chicken. Cheers, Maris said, and they clinked wine glasses full of fizzy water. She hadn't been able to give up the ritual. Maris took a big drink of LaCroix, the bubbles like small bites in her sinuses. She set her glass back on the table, the bubbles still in her nose, the oregano overpowering from the ratatouille. Had she thrown in too much? And then took a dramatic pause. Her hands rubbing circles over her cheeks as if the world had gone from complete black to light. At the sight of herself in the mirror, she gasped, her pulse jacking up to double time. What the hell? She was in her bathroom upstairs, out of her work slacks and blouse, and wearing an old pair of Noel's boxers and a ratty gray Huskers t-shirt, her usual pajamas. Whatever had happened, it wasn't like waking up, not exactly, because her eyes hadn't been closed. She stared at her startled reflection, not here and now here. Her hands shook and she held them in front of her, palms up. Her fingers were greasy. The plastic bottle of Olay, which she'd put on her face every night since her early 20s, except nights when she was too drunk to wash her face, sat cap off on the counter, and a swipe of white lotion was still visible on her cheek. What the hell had happened? She looked around the bathroom for other clues. The hand towel was damp, so she'd washed her face. She felt the bristles on her toothbrush, wet. She turned toward the bedroom as Noel appeared in the doorway, and she was so startled, she screamed, doubling over, a fist to her mouth. Shit! She collapsed with her hands on her knees, her heart hammering in her chest. You scared the shit out of me. I can see that. She looked at his face. He was trying not to laugh. Her startled response was a long-running joke. No matter that she knew he was home or even on the same floor or even likely to come talk to her, if he said her name and she hadn't heard him walk into the room, she yelped. Their favorite was the time she didn't realize he was in the bathroom downstairs, opened it to find him peeing, and she screamed. Jesus, she said, trying to laugh at herself as she stood up. I didn't realize you were home. Noel's expression changed from one of amusement to bafflement. What do you mean? A thread of dread unspooled in her stomach. It was that feeling she used to have on a somewhat regular basis. Back when she was drinking, someone would tell her something she'd done or said the night before, but no memory would surface. And she would have to laugh it off like she knew what they were talking about. But that hadn't happened for 7 months. And as much as she missed the drinking itself, since then, her life had been easier, calmer, like a tight muscle finally unclenched. She used her favorite rhetorical move when teaching, answer a question with a question. What do you mean, what do I mean? I got home a half hour ago. We talked in the kitchen. Oh, right, she said, instinctively, a smile wavering. He stared at her for a long beat. You okay? She rolled her eyes at herself. Yeah, sorry, I'm a little out of it tonight. She turned back to the mirror and washed her hands for lack of anything better to do. I met with Tammy today about tenure, she said as she dried her hands on the damp towel. She felt a flash of panic like she used to feel. What if she'd already told him downstairs? It used to irritate Noel, all the conversations he had to replay for her the next morning as she fumbled along like she'd only momentarily forgotten. What'd she have to say, Noel asked. Tammy was her chair and head of the sociology department promotion and tenure committee. Maris felt her shoulders relax that Noel had taken the bait to change the subject. But wait, she reminded herself, she had nothing to hide. She said that I should have been writing recognizable academic articles the past 5 years. Oh, Mayor, he said sympathetically, and she climbed into bed. And the vote? 12-4. She picked up her novel from the nightstand and set it on her lap, hands shaking. Every night when she came to bed, she brought up her phone, a glass of water, and her current novel. And there they all were, on the stand, dutifully waiting for her. She had no recollection she'd done such a thing. It was so eerily like a night of drinking. For a moment, she wondered, did I drink? Did I? But no, there was no booze in the house. She was sure she was sober. She rolled her tongue around her mouth and tasted only mint. Noel emerged from the closet as scrubs replaced with sweats. You're taking it better than I would have expected, he said, and lay down next to her on top of the covers, an arm tucked behind his head so she could see his armpit hair snaking out of the sleeve of his gray t-shirt. She rolled toward him and rested her head in the welcoming crevice. You sure you're okay? He asked. I just need a good night's sleep. She worked a demanding job, was hounded by trolls online for her articles on rape culture and masculinity, was raising a teenager, and was in her 40s. Of course, she needed a good night's sleep. Had it really been as bad as she thought, or had her mind just been distracted? Sometimes when a migraine hit, she could lose hours of the day to the pain, but she didn't have a migraine now, did she? Her head certainly hurt as adrenaline leaked slowly from her body, her fight or flight response activated. Noel was quiet for a moment, and it reminded her of the first few months after she quit. If she worked late in her office or had to stop at the library on the way home, she could feel his eyes on her when she came in the door, watching her silently, speculating. The way she hung her coat on the hook, set her purse on the bench. At those times, she'd kept her head erect as if there were a book on top of her skull as she walked, right foot, left foot, into the kitchen. She was being not only observed, but tested. It was difficult to speak at your regular speed with your normal enunciation when you knew someone was listening for an error. But this was different, she reminded herself. She hadn't mispronounced a word. She'd forgotten a chunk sober. Noel ran a hand over his hair. Long day for me too, he conceded as he stood up, and she let out a breath of relief. It's hard going from the night shift to the day, he said. We probably both need a good night's sleep, she agreed. He came over to her side of the bed, leaned over and kissed her. Had he sniffed her breath first? As he closed the bedroom door behind him, Maris rolled over, her heart still racing. Did he believe her? She wondered. Plus, there was the real question, just what the hell had happened? All right. So that's Blackout. So thank you guys for listening. So I'm going to introduce Josh now, and then he's going to read for a little bit, and then we're going to just chit chat about all the writing and the reading. So Josh is author of the memoir Down from the Mountaintop, From Belief to Belonging. He is also started a Substack. What was that, like 6 months ago, Josh? About that?
Gotta unmute myself. Yeah, I started it probably in February.
Okay, yeah. It's called The Recovering Academic. I've read every issue. It is just fantastic. And it's also a featured publication for 2022. And you also are working as co-producer on a podcast called Mid-America, Stories from a Changing Midwest. So please welcome Josh Dolezal.
Thanks so much, Erin. Yeah, it's really an honor to read with Erin. And I'm in the process of working on a memoir, the second book on fatherhood. And so what I'm going to read from today is an excerpt from a longer essay with the title Grieving Without God. I think religion or the lack of religion is part of parenting. And so this would fit into that collection. This essay was really inspired by losing both of my grandparents last year. 2 funerals, same year, and I attended both of them strangely on Facebook Live. So they were in the same church, and I attended as much as I'm doing now on my computer, both times in my office when I still had an academic office, and it was a very alienating experience to not be able to see anything other than what the screen was showing me. But even more alienating than that was that almost 6 months apart, the pastor gave almost the same eulogy. And I kind of took that personally because I thought of my grandparents as very unique people and deserving of a different story, each of them. But I also felt this tension. I felt kind of throughout my life, funerals typically happen in churches. And so if you are not a believer yourself, you sort of have to navigate your stance toward that. And because my family is fairly evangelical, these eulogies typically begin with a celebration of the departed's graduation into heaven, and then they end with something like an altar call where the pastor asks everyone who's listening. So in this case, my grandparents, Herman and Peggy, were ready. What about you? And so then there's sort of that chance for someone to get their life in order. And so there are all kinds of layers here of dissonance for me. And it really gave me the urge to explain sort of what it means to grieve without God. So I'm just going to read the excerpt that features my grandfather, and I'll start with that. My grandfather, Herman Dolezal, died in his nursing home while eating breakfast. As one caregiver told my grandmother, he leaned his banana against his glass and left us. He was 93 years old. Grandpa Herman was raised Catholic and later joined the Church of God with my grandmother. I have no doubt that my grandfather thought of his faith as sincere in the way that most Americans hold their hands over their hearts for the Star-Spangled Banner. The only outward demonstration of belief that he showed was his belt buckle, which featured Jesus cast in relief. The J on the buckle was a giant fishhook with an eyelet and barb, which might have struck some as biblical, I will make you fishers of men, but was probably meant more as a joke. If my grandfather could not fish on Sundays, he could at least wear a lure to church. It struck me during Grandpa's funeral that nearly everyone who spoke remembered him as a comedian and prankster, but there was no place for humor in the story of heaven. Grandpa worked for more than 40 years at the local sawmill and was the first in his labor union to use his health benefits for a vasectomy. Thereafter, his coworkers knew him as No Sperm Herm. It was impossible to picture him as an angel, singing God's praises ad infinitum with no desire to sneak down to his basement fridge for a can of Pepsi or beer. Part of my impatience with the pastor's eulogy was its attempt to sanitize my grandfather, to wash the salty notes from his life that made him so likable to nearly everyone who came to pay their respects. While the promise of heaven might have brought comfort to my grandmother and other believers, salvation itself was generic, identical for everyone. And in that way, it felt like an erasure of individuality, the denial of my grandfather's life rather than the celebration of it. I began to think defiantly of the stories that had been left out, how they told a truer story about the man I loved than the call to grace. There was, for instance, the Saturday when Grandpa bought me my first beer. We spent the morning ice fishing, packing our 5-gallon buckets a mile or so into a mountain lake, where we chopped holes in the ice with a hatchet, flipped the buckets over for seats, and watched our bobbers for action from below. Grandpa lounged in his bomber hat and insulated coveralls while I shivered in my long johns and a pair of oversized wool pants. Grandpa retold stories without tiring of them, the way a band cycles through its greatest hits. How he used to hide in the onion patch on their Nebraska farm during games of hide and seek. How he gave himself away by bending the green stalks to his mouth. His block punt during the first Montana East-West Shrine All-Star football game in 1947. How he loved the taste of blood in his mouth after a hard tackle. As the morning wore on, we staved off boredom with jokes. I remember his gap-toothed grin as he cracked, "What do you call an abortion in Prague?" "A canceled check." He could scarcely deliver the line, he was laughing so hard, and I sat frozen in shock for a moment before joining him. Memory allows me to picture the scene from above, the frozen lake, the old man and the boy on their buckets, the evergreen forest echoing with their laughter. Our drive home led through the tiny town of Yaak, Montana, identifiable only by its mercantile and by the Dirty Shame Saloon. I was 15 years old then, a high school sophomore, and I knew of the Dirty Shame as part of the legendary Yak Attack, a 70-mile bar crawl that began at the Silver Spur in Troy, hit the Hell-Roaring Saloon and the Dirty Shame along the Yak River, and ended at the Red Dog near Libby. According to my youth pastor, the Yak Attack was the kind of thing a person did if they didn't have God. So I was wholly unprepared when my grandfather pulled his pickup into the parking lot at the Dirty Shame and beckoned for me to join him inside. I remember the walk up the stairs, how the world seemed to brighten and blur as I crossed the threshold. There was nothing remarkable about the bar or the pine table we chose or the cans of Coors that my grandfather ordered, and the white fire that lit my belly quickly faded. And that might have been the lesson Grandpa intended. He was well aware of the tight strictures at my church, how my parents did their best to wall off the world from our 20 acres in the country. As we sipped our beer, he told me stories I'd never heard before about his double dates with my grandmother and their best friends, Harry and Irene, in high school. Harry took them all on long drives, and Irene watched in the rearview mirror as my grandparents kissed in the back. They enjoyed attending dances as young married couples, Grandpa said. But one time he had to take my grandmother home after she began mixing beer and Coke and draping herself over other men. He winked at me as he finished his Coors. "I never had eyes for anyone other than your grandmother," he said. "I probably could have married another girl and learned to love her, but your grandmother was the one for me." I never shared another beer with my grandfather, and he never told these stories again. It was as if the world inside the bar opened into a part of his life that he carried with him all the time, but could never speak of in church or in our family of believers. I can feel in the retelling a jostling for primacy, how I invest this story with an importance that my grandfather might not have seen, and that my grandmother would have sought to downplay. I don't mean to say that I encountered my grandfather's real self at the Dirty Shame Saloon, nor do I intend it as a counterproof against his faith. He moved comfortably enough in both worlds, and he was trying to teach me, in his understated way, how to do the same. I loved my grandfather as much for his lies as for his honesty. How boring it would be if all those lovable wrinkles were simply cleansed by the blood of the Lamb. As my grandfather lives on in my memory, I intend to keep him intact as he was, not as his church wished him to be. I'd be the first to wish my grandfather eternity in paradise. But when one man rose during the funeral testimonials and urged us to think of Grandpa Herman as 30 years old, tanned and smiling, the childishness of that fantasy brought Santa Claus and the Easter Bunny to mind. Instead of leaving us presents at Christmas or treats at Easter, God takes us to a place that looks, in every retelling, curiously like a hedonistic dream, replete with streets of gold. Those who find solace in such a story are welcome to it, but I have no need to imagine my grandfather living on in a spirit world. He lives within the memories of all who knew him, within my body and the bodies I've passed on to my children, and in the soil that will draw life from his bones. He's the reminder I carry within me to back away from the argument while guarding my own self-respect. And he'll always be the man who could tell an abortion joke while wearing a belt buckle that said Jesus, who could wear that buckle into a bar while buying a beer for his underage grandson. The man who could air my grandmother's dirty laundry and profess his undying love for her in the same uncensored breath. So that's the end of my excerpt. And so I guess we have a chance to chat back and forth, Erin. Maybe I'll kick it back to you to start. So I have on.
Can I ask something about the essay real quick?
Oh, sure.
It was so wonderful. And it makes me think too, oh gosh, I love nonfiction so much, like all those details. I mean, you have to remember them and you have to shape them, everything, but I'm like that fishing lure on the belt buckle and the course, like such great details. But what struck me about it too is because I have been stalking you on this Substack of yours, is that I feel like one of the things you're really kind of grappling with in that is the idea of these different identities, like who am I outside of my academic job? Who am I as a father? And so the idea of him having to like silo those different things or having the church do it to him is really, I mean, really sad. And I can see, and I think you're dealing a lot with masculinity in your Substack. And so like seeing how that all kind of comes together, it was a wonderful essay.
Oh, well, thanks so much. Yeah, I think for men of my grandfather's generation, there was a lot of that. You know, they had experiences in the war that they could never talk about. There was a lot of buried sort of memories. And so for him, there were these moments when I would go to hunting camp with him. He had a wall tent, an old army wall tent, and we would stay there for a week and hunt elk, you know, in this place where we had access to someone's property. And so there were stories he would tell there that never came back anywhere else. I mean, even if it was just the two of us at a McDonald's, he wouldn't tell that kind of story. So it had to be in a bar, or it had to be in a wall tent. You know, those kinds of places unlocked that part of himself. So he was kind of an expert at compartmentalizing in that way. I'm not sure I'm quite as good at that myself.
I don't think that's a bad thing.
Yeah. Well, so you mentioned drawing details from our lives. And, you know, I think as fiction writers, we do the same thing, don't we? We just put them in different places, or we have more freedom for invention. You know, so I've been so struck by details in your novels and your short stories as well. But in deer season, you know, it's been months or almost a year since I read that, I suppose. And I still remember the image of the radio velcroed to the dash of the bus. So one of your characters drives a bus, you know, and so that it's the Velcro, I think, that does it. The bubbles in Maris's nose from the LaCroix, the lotion on her hands after the blackout. She rolls her tongue over through her mouth and gets only mint. So those are all things that you've experienced, right? And you're just plugging them in different places.
To some extent, yeah. Definitely. So my mom drove a bus, and there was, I don't think it was hers, but there was a radio Velcroed right in there. So that is the best way to get a stick if anybody's trying to figure out how to get their old radio on a bus. But yeah, some of them too are, like I use oil of Olay, which is what Maris uses, and things like that. I think you just try, like what I try to do is I just try to sit as deeply in the character as I can. And I think it's funny to like give her the same kind of face lotion, or give her LaCroix because I like to drink LaCroix, you know, and little things like that. I think they do go a long way to being realistic, you know, to getting the detail right. And sometimes when I'm writing, like I'm working on something right now where there's a character who's pretty different from me, and I'm having a harder time like with those kind of details. I'm like, oh, I know it has to be this kind of detail, but I don't know what it is yet. And I just keep my ears open. I am always shocked, and I'll be curious, I bet you feel this way too. What details come to you when you're open? If you're thinking about writing, if you're kind of deeply into a story, you're just out in the world and people say things and you're like, oh, that's the kind of language that I've been looking for. What was it that somebody said the other day? There was some kind of like really flat, dry joke. And I'm like, oh, that's the mom, you know, and I try to go from there on stuff like that. But yeah, I think all of writing is in the details.
For sure. So I'm curious, and I don't know if this is the direction that, you know, our listeners want to go in, but having written a novel myself, I know that I tend to line it up kind of with my experience in the way that I do in nonfiction. Then I just have more freedom around the edges. So in Blackout, Maris really has this kind of problem with her tenure committee because she's a popular writer. She writes for Vox and Wall Street Journal and places and doesn't publish in peer-reviewed journals, but she's a sociology professor and you're a professor of English. And I'm curious if there's any sort of overlap between that kind of prejudice against popular writing and what you've experienced as a creative writer. I mean, by all accounts, you've sailed through to full professor. Look, that's what it looks like to me. But I'm wondering if there's, I don't know, snarky comments in your personnel file along the way that sort of feed that character a little bit.
There could be. There could be. I don't want to see that file. I can tell you that much. There's a great sociologist. What is it? Tressie McCotton, I think is her name. And she's like, what people think of me is none of my business. And I'm like, I get that. So I feel like I've, yes, Tressie McMillan Cotton. Thank you. She is, yeah, she's fantastic. But I do think that I didn't want to do an English professor. I've had, like, I did not have any issues with my tenure case, but I'm very lucky to be at a university that has a union for faculty. So it was very much laid out. Like, here are your boxes to check. You need this many publications. Here's how we count if they count. And so, like, I felt like everybody in my department really had my back and it went pretty well. But one of the things that Maris is dealing with and the other characters are dealing with in Blackout is like how women are treated in the culture at large and in academia. And so I wanted something that was going to kind of resonate as far as like her job with these larger issues that she's writing about and dealing with. And I think a lot of times things that are of interest to women, and I'm just going to go ahead and say, I think a lot of the humanities kind of falls into that category, that there is sometimes that sense of like, oh, those aren't as important of issues. And so I did check with a sociologist. She read like an early draft of the stuff where I talked about Maris's. And I'm like, does this sound accurate? Because I had heard like just here and there talking with other academics that that was a problem. And I see it too in English, where this idea of what we're doing as public writing like has a harder time than scholarship. And I think it's clearer in some ways for creative writing, right? Like this is what I'm expected to do, is write a novel. But I have colleagues who are doing really interesting stuff that's accessible academic public writing. And I think that they've had more of an issue because it's not like, oh, this is a scholarly article. And it doesn't really make sense to me because I'm like, do you mean this article that went viral that thousands of people read is not like, that's really part of the discourse? Like, it seems to me it should so obviously fit, but I don't think that's necessarily always the case. What do you think? Have you seen that?
Well, sure. And in that case, it's ironic because the article that goes viral is probably the better model for what students would be expected to write themselves, right? So there's a kind of strangeness, I think, to the formal writing assignments that are completely untethered from what most students will go on to produce professionally. That's something we wrestled with in my department,
Yeah.
before I left. Whether a blog post, could be a rigorous academic assignment or not.
Yeah, no, I think that it's like, I see why it's an issue, but I'm surprised like that we're not further along in the issue in figuring out what to do about it. Yeah.
Yep.
So you have been out of academia for a little while now. Yep. How do you feel about that? How do you get up in the morning? What time do you get out of pajamas? I need to know everything. I'm so curious, like what it's like not to have that kind of structure.
Yeah, so the schedule has not changed all that much. I still get up at 5 a.m. just because there's time that, I can use in the morning before the kids are up that I can't get back any other way. So in my old life, I used to either run or work out during that time before breakfast, and then take the kids to school typically. But now I've been using that time for writing. And so I have an hour and a half, before the kids wake up to kind of start something moving, and then I take them to school and come back and try to keep working on it. There is a challenge when you work from home as opposed to an office, because you're home, you're available for running all these errands, and so your day can really get carved up, and you don't really have a full writing life. So I'm still navigating that. I mean, part of the reason we moved was to move closer to my wife's family, so our kids could have the experience I did growing up, building close ties with their elders, their grandparents. And it was a pandemic decision. I'll never regret it. There was no way I could justify my job as the only reason they couldn't have that experience. But it's also true that when I was a professor, just out of necessity, I had to be in front of students. It often felt, I think, to my wife, like my job was more important, even though I didn't feel that way. It was just sort of how things shook out. If there was a sick kid or something, I just couldn't cancel class and stay home with them more than a few times. And so this move was also a chance to give her the bulk of the workday. And so she's the primary earner. And so the writing, I've really had to kind of tone back some of my goals, because I think in academia, you're primed to just produce as much as you can. I've had to learn a little bit of contentment with, it'll take as long as it takes. The world isn't waiting necessarily for another book from me right now. And so there are other higher priorities. And if I have some time to write, I will gladly make use of it. Does that help at all?
Yeah, no, that's interesting. So I have it's taped on my laptop up here. I have a note to myself that says, this is what I'm doing right now. So every time I'm like, oh, I should be getting more done. I'm like, nope, what you're doing right now is revising the sentence. What you're doing right now is working on this essay or even this email or whatever it is. So that makes a lot of sense to me. And it's interesting too, that you mentioned like a full writing day or something. And I have found that if I do 4 hours of hard work, like hard writing work, I'm like, oh, that's done. Like there's like, that's a lot of thinking, but it takes me like 8 to 9 hours to do that. Like when I've been on leaves or like just coming off of the summer, like I work for an hour and a half and then I'm like, oh, I need a break. And then I'll do dishes or whatever, or, sit and read or whatever. But like it's hard work, right? It's silly because we're just sitting, but it is like mentally, I think, pretty exhausting.
Yep. Yeah. 4 hours for me is about the limit. Sometimes I can push it to 5, but yeah, typically if I have 8:30 to 12:30 uninterrupted, the kids are at school and I have 8:30 to 12:30, I can get a lot of headway done. My problem is typically I need to do that several days in a row for it to be efficient. If I've been off it for a while, I really do have to waste a lot of time to ramp back up. I've tried tricks, listening to Chopin's nocturnes or something. They say music can get you there faster. I'm not sure that's always true. But I do have a question for you about this. So there were, I think, 8 years between your first and second book, and then another 8 years between your second and third. And then somehow you started cranking these novels out during a pandemic. How the hell did that happen? Like, what happened to your whole productivity schedule to allow that pace to pick up so much?
Well, it's of course nothing like that, really. So in the time that I was writing short stories, I wasn't thinking like, oh, these are necessarily going to be a book. It would just get to a point where I had like the right kind of stories that I felt went together. And I was like, oh, that one might be a book. But in the background that whole time, like between the short story collections, starting as early as like when I was finishing up my PhD, I was writing novels. So I wrote 4 novels that never sold. And it wasn't like I wrote just a draft, like they were revised. They went out on submission. Nobody wanted them, so I'm like, it was really kind of devastating. But the whole time that I'm working on short stories and publishing those, I'm writing these novels in the background, and it's taking me like, 3 or 4 years each time. And then to have that huge rejection at the end, it's tough, but it's just kind of, I needed to write those to kind of figure it out. When I sat down with Deer Season, I was like, oh, I think I need to have a plot. Like somehow that hadn't really occurred to me before. Like I had a plot, but it wasn't enough of a structure for me to get the novel to work. So Deer Season is a mystery, and I was like, okay, this thing happens that's dramatic at the beginning. This young girl goes missing. That's how I can kind of get the story to go. And that I think made a big difference. So I wrote that. I tried to get an agent, and that was another year of like I couldn't get an agent. And then Nebraska, I contacted them because I'd had such a great relationship with them, and they were happy to publish it. And I was thrilled to be back with them. And so it was in production for like a year or two. So in that time, I got the idea for Blackout, which was like one where I was like, oh, it felt like the first like real, like kind of full novel idea that had come to me in a long time. So I wrote that and I started that before Deer Season was out. So I think it actually had sold before Deer Season came out. So, and I wrote it for me very quickly. It took me 22 months. And I tracked like all of my time, all of my hours. And then I broke that down and was like, what's this data telling me? And what it told me was I hate first drafts. And so I'm working on one right now. And I wrote the first draft in, I think it was 2.5 months, because I was like, you hate this, just do 2,000 words a day, every day, no matter what. And for the most part I did. So I was able to write a draft fast, but so yeah, I'm getting faster, but I'm not getting less hours, if that makes any sense. So,
Sure.
but yeah,
Well,
no, all those novels that didn't sell, like I was writing the whole time, it's just, there'd be a market for it. And now I look back and I'm like, I'll never sell those things.
I know Max wants to jump in. I want to just piggyback a little bit. So Erin and I have emailed about Lisa Cron's book, Story Genius, where she uses neuroscience research, to talk about the components of an effective story. And one of the things that she mentions is that the main character has to have an inner struggle. A lot of writers mistake sort of external conflict, these dramatic scenes and that kind of plotting as what propels a narrative, but really there has to be the inner struggle that the reader adopts as their own. And so Maris's drinking really does that in Blackout, I think even more than your characters in Deer Season. So I can see you kind of following that arc. So it's cool to see that progress.
And it's what I care about, as I'm writing, like what's going on with the blackouts was of interest, but in the first draft, it was something completely different than it ends up being in the final draft. Like I was just like, oh, that's not as interesting to me as the characters.
Such an interesting conversation. And I really wanted to ask both of you two really specific craft questions that I think are as closely related as they could be between fiction and nonfiction. So I think because you just had the last long question, Erin, I'll ask Josh first, but then I want to come to you. So for Josh, you're writing memoir, and I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you treat yourself as a character, such as that kid sitting on the bucket, or even when you're writing about yourself in your current age, as opposed to the narrator who is creating that character and telling us the story.
I don't think of it as really terribly different from how we carry ourselves in, social settings all our lives. Like I used to do exercises with my creative writing class on audience, and I gave them a scenario. I can't take credit for it. I don't know. Maybe it's Mike Schuess. Daryl and Erin will remember him as a fellow grad. So I don't know if I got this from him or somebody else, but the scenario is you're with your fiance at a party and you're standing by the punch bowl and your fiance goes to the restroom. Meanwhile, a gorgeous stranger approaches you and you're both intensely attracted to each other and you have the same profession. And then you have to tell that same story to 4 different audiences. So if you're, a guy or a girl, you tell it to the best friend of the same sex. That's one audience. Then you have to tell it to the parent of the opposite sex. So if you're a guy, you tell it to your mom. If you're a woman, you tell it to your father. You have to tell this story to a priest or a pastor, and you have to tell the story to your fiance. you're 4 different people and all 4 of those versions of the same event. And it's the same thing we do all the time when we're writing emails to someone. Yeah, I'm sure you've noticed this. You have a different voice, for your partner than you do for your parent, or, for a professional acquaintance. You invent a persona for the needs of that particular situation. So I think I'm always sort of anticipating a reader's response. And I have a particular kind of reader in mind. It's not quite as large, I think, an audience as some writers, but I do sort of make moves with that audience's reaction kind of in the back of my thoughts. So I don't want to go on too much longer, but hopefully that helps.
And brief follow-up, then obviously you would have, a broad audience though. So do you focus more on the consistency of the character you're creating, or is it just that interplay between that character and your audience?
Max, I can't tell you that I consciously create a character. I think it's much more of the intuitive thing that you feel in a social situation. And I'm telling a particular kind of story. So in the essay I read from, Grieving Without God, I know that I'm going to be writing this to people who are believers. I'm not anticipating that my audience is going to be just a bunch of atheists. And I know that it'll be uncomfortable, but I'm not going to censor the abortion joke just because it makes someone uncomfortable. That's part of the point, right? Of what gets edited out of a eulogy. It's a kind of dishonesty that I find alienating in those ceremonies. And so there are times when I won't pull that punch, but I will not try to maintain that same stridency of tone throughout, right? So I want a little bit of modulation. I'll pick the place to be really intense or aggressive, and then I'll pull back a little bit, same as I might if I was just talking to you over beers.
Fair enough, thank you. And so along those lines, Erin, I was surprised when I was reading Blackout when a first person narrator showed up and it wasn't Maris. So often when you have these novels that tell a couple of different points of view in different chapters, your first person narrator will be the one that is your protagonist. So can you talk a little bit about that choice? And I don't want to give anything away about who the first person narrator is or anything because it's a thriller, but can you talk about that craft choice anyway, that technique?
Yeah, so no, it was interesting. My editor actually was the one who recommended I add the second point of view character. And I didn't, typically in a thriller, it would be the protagonist, like, what's the bad guy up to? And I didn't really want to do that. Partly, I didn't want to give that guy a voice. And partly, I was intrigued by the character who does the first person, and it's thematically, it fits the book to have her kind of telling part of her story. But the first to third was really just like a logistical choice. I couldn't figure out. I started her in third and she sounded like Maris, the main character. And I was like, she's such a different character. Something here isn't working. And also I wasn't sure how I would indicate it in the book. Like, I didn't want to use her name because I was hoping in the beginning, and this I don't think actually happened. But like I was thinking it would be a little ambiguous who she was. Like it kind of is, but not as much as like I thought it was going to be originally. And so I'm like, I tried first because then I wouldn't have to use her name at the top, and it would be different enough that I thought I could get away with it. So sometimes it just comes down to logistics of like, how can I do this?
Yeah, that's really great. I can see where logistics would be the point. I wonder if you might expand then also just on because when you said you didn't want to give that character, that antagonist, a voice, I was over here cheering because I agree that person shouldn't have a choice. So can you talk a little bit also about sort of the woman power aspect of your novel that is very clear to me anyway, and part of why or how you're writing that?
Yeah. So I was really determined when I started the book that it was going to be like Maris was going to come in contact with other women, and that they were all going to be supportive and like get it done together. Like I really wanted that to be kind of the center. Again, I was thematically like, what is this novel trying to do versus like, it wasn't, I just didn't want it to be all plot, you know, I struggle with that and I didn't want that to take over. Like Josh was saying, I think character is where it's at. So I tried to think like, what do I really want to say with this? And I really, I've been reading like a ton of thrillers. I love reading thrillers. And there were so many that seemed to be taking place where women were kind of backstabbing and out to get each other. And I'm working on a toxic female friendship book right now. So like, obviously I love that too. But I feel like I really wanted to showcase like women working together and that part of what they're doing is showing that collective power that they have. So I'm glad that it reads that way to you. And I've gotten like, it was like Josh said, an Amazon First Reads, which means that for 1 month before it's released, anybody with Amazon Prime can get one of the 8 books that are offered for free, and or they can pay like $1.99 if they don't have Prime. And so a lot of people ordered the book, and a lot of people do not share my physical leanings, or not physical, my political leanings. Maybe they never share my physical, I don't know, my political leanings. And so I got some, you know, some backlash for it. And I'm like, well, not every book is going to make everybody happy, you know. Somebody, like one of the first reviews I got was like, she's racist against white men. And I'm like, oh, you're selling the book for me. but it was, you know, people are on there, and they would also say, and you can't, she's illiterate, I can't even read this book, you know. So it's really hard, even though you feel like, you know, people are making these based on your beliefs, but I'm like, you believe what you believe, that's what you make the story from.
That's really amazing. You know, I think I told you, I read it and I'd been trying to read it and I was busy, and then all of a sudden it grabbed a hold of me and I spent an entire night until, you know, the middle of the wee hours of the morning reading it, and told my mom to read it, and she felt the same way. She read all night too. So it definitely grabs hold of the people with my genetics. We loved reading it. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much.
And I did want to emphasize that if the people here who are attending and who watch the video, Josh's Substack newsletter is one of the only ones that I regularly read. You're so thoughtful, and your topics vary enough. I mean, I'm not sure what you're going to write about next time, and so I'm always interested in it. So I want to encourage people to find, we put the link in the chat, but find that newsletter and read it. It's definitely worth your time. So
It's fantastic. I can't believe you're cranking those out every week.
I don't know how.
I don't know how you're doing it.
Yeah, it's not always easy to do, but you know, I started it. Before I get into that, I wanted to say, you know, I share everything Max saying about Blackout. I found it really an engaging read, and you know, as a father of daughters, you know, it's not just other women that I think are the audience for that kind of thing. So I appreciate that book.
Thanks.
Well, and you know, we're trying really hard to stick to 1 hour, and we are creeping up on that 8 o'clock hour. So I just wanted to thank both Erin and Josh for your time tonight and your insight into your writing process. It's been such an interesting talk. And thank you to everybody for coming here as well. So
Yes, thank you, Max and Kat.
Thanks for having us. Thanks for
Yes,
coming.
this was fantastic. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Good night, everybody.
Good night.